Dear viewers, now we will show you one of the greatest miracles of the Quran, where none of you need to know even a single word of it. It is the numerical structure of the Quran, which indicates that the Quran has a divine source that it is impossible to imitate, and that it has been preserved from distortion from the beginning of its revelation until today. God gives us a visual example in the Quran through science and mathematics, demonstrating why the Quran is God's book and not man's, especially at a time when modern science is popular, with mathematics being the most popular branch. In times when people wonder which divine book is truly from God and not from man, and which book has been preserved by God from human distortion, this example strengthens our faith that the Quran is the true divine book, unchanged from the beginning of its revelation until today. The purpose of these divine proofs in the Quran is to provide additional evidence for those who question whether it is indeed God's book, so they can gain conviction and follow this book, which serves as a manual for people on how to live according to God's instructions, explaining where we come from, where we are going, what awaits us after death, and what our purpose on earth is. The entire structure of the most massive numerical miracle in the Quran can be derived from the ordinal numbers of the surahs and the number of verses in those surahs. When we multiply the surah number by the number of verses in that surah, we obtain a set of 57 even and 57 odd numbers in the third column. Having 57 even and 57 odd numbers in this case is the first observation of a numerical structure that does not have to be that way, since the determination of the number of verses in the surahs decides how many even and odd numbers we will have. In the fourth column, we transfer the even numbers from the third column, and in the fifth column, we transfer the odd numbers from the third column, thus obtaining the even totals and odd totals columns. The sum of all the ordinal surah numbers is 6,555, which is the same as the sum of all odd numbers in the fifth column, while the sum of all the verses is 6,236, which matches the sum of all even numbers in the fourth column. That these large numbers, 6,555 and 6,236, match the sums of the even and odd numbers clearly indicates intentional encoding between the ordinal surah numbers and the number of verses in those surahs. Next, we create a column labeled Chapter with Even Totals, which contains the ordinal numbers of the surahs that have an even total. Then we create a column with the verses of the surahs that have an odd total. Here we see that the sum of all the numbers in both columns is 3,303, which is clear evidence of intentional encoding because these are large numbers that match. The next column is chapter numbers, last half, which have even verses. This column contains the ordinal numbers of the surahs in the second half of the Quran that have an even number of verses. The following column shows the even verses in the first half of the Quran. Here, we also see that the sum of these two columns is 2,690. The column, prime number order based on prime numbered verses, is where we take the ordinal number corresponding to the prime number of verses. For example, Surah Al-Fatiha has 7 verses, and 7 is a prime number. It can only be divided by itself and 1. The ordinal number of the prime number 7 is 17. Use this table to verify these data. The column non-prime numbered verses contains the verse numbers that are not prime. The sum of these two columns is 5,160. Column verses of prime numbered order of the chapters which are not divisible by 19 contains the verses from the surahs whose ordinal numbers are not divisible by 19. For example, surahs 2, 3, and 5 are prime numbers, so we take the verses from those surahs and place them in that column. Column prime numbers which are extracted from divisibility by 19 the order numbers of the chapters, contains the prime numbers of those surahs that are divisible by 19, such as surah numbers 19, 38, 57, etc. These two columns together have a total sum of 2,000. This is not the end of the numerical structure. If we look at the sum of the surah numbers plus the verses in the chapter plus verses column, we obtain both recurring and non-recurring numbers. The sum of the recurring numbers is 7,906, and if we divide that number by the sum of the non-recurring numbers from the column, which is 4,885, we get the golden ratio number of 1.618. This massive structure in the Quran clearly indicates intentional encoding by God, since it is unimaginable that people in the 7th century could have created something like this, considering all the circumstances at the time when the Quran came to earth. What would happen with the Quranic structure if we were to add or remove only one verse in the Quran? If we deliberately decided to change only one verse in the Quran, either by adding or removing a verse, what would happen to the Quranic symmetry that we have observed? For instance, if we remove just one verse from Surah 109 so that instead of 6 verses it had 5, the following would occur. All the symmetry would be destroyed, as you can see in the image. This visually and mathematically demonstrates how the Quran is a preserved book from the time of its revelation in the 7th century, and serves as further confirmation of God's promise in the Quran, where He says, "Indeed, it is we who sent down the Quran, and indeed, we will be its guardian." First, we need to understand how revelation from God was delivered to Muhammad. Zayd bin Thabit, one of the chief scribes, relates, "I used to write down the revelation for the Holy Prophet, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. When the revelation came to him, he felt intense heat, and drops of perspiration used to roll down his body like pearls. When this state was over, I used to fetch a shoulder bone or a piece of something else. He used to go on dictating, and I used to write it down. When I finished writing, the sheer weight of transcription gave me the feeling that my leg would break, and I would not be able to walk anymore. Anyhow, when I finished writing, he would say, 'Read,' and I would read it back to him. If there was an omission or error, he used to correct it and then let it be brought before the people." Hadith al-Tabarani. Then, we need to understand it from Muhammad's perspective and the circumstances during the revelation. 1. Muhammad was illiterate. He could neither read nor write. 2. They did not have computers, calculators, enough paper, or search programs, meaning they had to rely entirely on their memory. 3. Another important thing to mention is Muhammad's difficult situation during the revelation period. He was beaten, humiliated, and lived under economic sanctions. He experienced hunger, fear, and sorrow due to the deaths of family members. He also faced war because idolaters attacked him in many instances. Imagine being in a war zone and wanting to write a book that you claim is from God. Would you be thinking about numerical coding while you are in a war zone? You are fighting. Bullets and grenades are flying around, and now you are expected to recite a text that is numerically coded? I doubt that. 4. Many numerical miracles in the Quran include the arrangement of chapter numbers and verse numbers. During the time of revelation, there was no numbering of chapters and verses. The endings of verses were marked only with symbols or decorations indicating where a verse ended. Thus, people could not refer to specific verses by number, such as verse 34 or verse 57. The numbering of verses came long after the revelation of the Quran was completed. It was introduced later to make it easier to refer to specific verses using numbers instead of saying, "the verse in which it says this and that." Now, imagine that you don't have numbered verses. How difficult would it be for a person to create a numerical pattern without using verse numbers? It would be an absolute nightmare to try to program numerical structures without numbered verses. The fact that verse numbers did not exist during Prophet Muhammad's lifetime is further proof that the numerical coding of the Quran comes from God. This is because multiple layers of difficulty would make it impossible for anyone to create something like the Quran when considering all the challenges mentioned above. Dear viewers, here you can see the entire table illustrating its massive and impressive nature. If anyone wishes to verify these findings, you can use the numbers from this table to confirm with your own hands and eyes what we have presented to you in this video.